Looks like we are the last thing between you and dinner. So we'll see if we're going to take the full 50 minutes. It depends on how many questions you have. Can I ask you, how many of you know what a verifiable credential is? Okay. And how many of you know what Pixie does? No. So verifiable credentials. Let's start maybe with a quick primer, since not everyone raised their hand. If you want to prove who you are, why not just sending a PDF, or take a photo of your passport, send that? What would you say? Is that not a great solution? Why do we need verifiable credentials?
Could be a start, but
but you don't think it should be the end?
no, I think one of the main cool things of verifiable credentials is they're machine readable, right? So if you send it to some other organization, agent, or entity, it can read it, right? It can understand it. That's a big difference.
Yeah, I think the name itself gives in a little. So if we do in the way that you just mentioned, Daniel, I think it's not verifiable to begin with, and we don't know the origin of the data that we are processing, or the data can't even trust the data itself we are processing. So when we say verifiable credential, or to that extend it to digital identity, so I always tell our integrator that we are in a trust business rather than an ordinary IT business. So I think that should be enough.
So we want it to be verifiable, but then why not use a solution like login with Facebook, or some federated identity solution? Is there anything that sets verifiable credentials apart from these IDPs?
I mean, Facebook really doesn't provide you with much in the level of assurance about who the user is. But I mean, I think that the key thing with the verifiable credentials is that you're actually getting some proof that the person presenting it is actually the person that owns the document. So compared to the current process where you might submit a scan of your passport or something, and then the verifier still has to check, are you actually the person that's shown on that passport? We can avoid that with verifiable credentials and just speed up the whole process and avoid these screens where you have to try and take selfies of yourself and nod up and down and get the lighting right and smile and all kinds of unreasonable requests.
Yeah, so I think all of us are reasonably excited about verifiable credentials. I hope we can convince you in the next 45 minutes or so, if you're not already convinced that verifiable credentials are the way to go, because they're really quite amazing. They are, on the one hand, something that you hold in your hands, just like a physical passport. You don't need any third party to say, yes, this is really you. It's enough for you to hold this piece of data in your hands. And as we heard, it is verifiable. It is actually cryptographically enhanced. It is something that in and of itself can prove that the information is correct, something that a PDF cannot, right? So it is much, much better than anything you might be able to photograph with your own camera, and it is something that you have. So we're excited about verifiable credentials. Where are we, would you say, in this journey? When I look at you and I look at Bhutan, I mean, you are a small country, but you are a superpower in terms of verifiable credentials. I think have you been the first country that issued actually a verifiable solution on a country basis?
Yeah, I think we are the first country to have a decentralized identity system. So we formally launched it in October 2023. So we have adopted the self-sovereign identity philosophy in our Bhutan NDI. So the project began, earlier the project did begin with a centralized model of identity system, but we pivoted to the decentralized after learning about the SSI philosophy, and all the cards actually were in place for us to actually pivot to the decentralized system. So at this moment of time, we have onboarded almost 200,000 users, which might look like a very small figure, but we have a total population of 700,000, so it's something that we are proud of.
And the 700,000 includes children and
the actual
everyone.
The actual person who can legally get identity, of age is I think around 500,000 users. So we are almost
40%.
Yeah, 40%. So right now we give the foundation ID, and then based on those foundation ID, we have other use cases where someone can get a university degree from the University of Bhutan. You can open your bank account and get a bank card. And then also we recently have driving license, which is not, I think it's a DML compliant right now. And then recently our team has also, I think, executed pass your picture as a VC, which is a big thing because that was something lagging and stopping us to actually go to organizations and convince them to integrate with us. So yeah, I think I can say that we have optimally used the verifiable credentials, and although there's a long way to go to convince few organizations, but I think we are doing good for now.
So a little country that is having a big impact in verifiable credentials. Joseph, you're not representing a country, but you're representing an organization that is a non-profit and also has an outsized impact on this industry. Can you talk a little bit about what the OpenlD Foundation does and what your connection is to SDJobs and verifiable credentials?
Yep, sure. So I'll maybe focus on the most relevant bit that OpenlD Foundation does first, which is we're defining the OpenlD for verifiable credential issuance and OpenlD for verifiable presentation specification. So that's been done by one of the working groups that I co-chair with Christina and Torsten. So that's defining the actual protocols of how the data will transfer from the issuer, the credential producer, to the wallet, the entity holding it on behalf of the user, and then how that transfers to the verifier, the relying party that's actually wanting to receive the credential and use that information and be able to check that it has been presented by the person it's meant to be and that kind of thing. So we're seeing very good adoption of these protocols at the moment. So for example, they're explicitly named in the ISO mobile driving license specification, so 18013-7 Annex B tells you how to do mobile driving licenses using OpenlD for verifiable presentations to present them over the web. These protocols are also being picked up by some of the US states that are using mobile driving licenses. And then in the EU, we're currently going through the process with the EU so that both of those specs, along with another one that we call the high assurance interoperability profile, which really takes those specs and refines them so that they are more interoperable and more suitable for the cases where you're using personal identity documents and those kind of higher value documents. So we're going through the process with the EU right now so that they can actually list those documents in what they're calling the Implementing Act for the European digital wallets. So they'll actually be named in law as something that people should be using. So that will obviously then hopefully encourage or enforce all the member states to actually implement these protocols. And there's a similar process going on with SDJOT as well. So that's in a different standards body, the IETF, but we're working very closely with the SDJOT authors, and we've got a lot of members in common in the OpenlD Foundation and the OpenlD for verifiable presentations and verifiable credential issuance spec. They're agnostic to the underlying credential formats, so you can use SDJOTs, you can use MDocs or MDLs, you can use ANON-creds, you can use W3C VCs, they're all there. But then when we talk about the high assurance interoperability profile, which is the document we're expecting the EU, the European Union to adopt and also name in law, then that actually narrows down the choices and it says you're really going to use just MDocs and SDJOTs. And the reason the whole SDJOT format came about is very much, there's a history there with the OpenlD Foundation, that it was OpenlD Foundation that originally defined the JSON Web Token or JWT specification, which is now widely used across the whole internet, but was primarily originally invented to represent the ID token that's returned in OpenlD Connect. that returns the actual information about the user, but as I say, it's been used for all kinds of things since, and it's been very well accepted by web developers. I mean, as with any technology, it has its critics, and there have been issues, but it's a very well understood spec now. We know how not to run into the issues. And SDJOT really builds on top of that specification, and it adds what we'd call selective disclosure to these tokens. So it means the issuer can send to the user's wallet a credential that's a full credential, like their driving license or their ID document that has their name, their date of birth, their address, and so on. But when the user comes to actually use that with a verifier, they can choose, or the verifier can request, actually, I only need a date of birth in this case, and to know that the person with that date of birth is the one interacting with me. So the user doesn't want to, or doesn't even have to share their address or their name, so it's very privacy preserving, and the SDJOT format is what allows that to happen. And you can essentially change the object to remove some of the fields, but the object is still there and signed, so you can tell that, yes, this did come from an issuer that I actually trust. It hasn't been modified in a way the issuer didn't want it to be. It's just had some of these fields not disclosed, but I can still see the user's date of birth is here. It's genuinely come from this issuer, and I can verify that cryptographically.
So that's another thing that I think is really fascinating. You know, if you are entering a club and you need to show that you're over 18, if you show a piece of identity to the doorman, you actually disclose a lot more information than you really need, right? I'll probably see your first name, your last name, your photo. I'll probably see your full date of birth, when really the only thing you need is older than 18 or older than 21. And that's something a piece of paper simply can't do, but a verifiable credential can. So selective disclosure, really, really exciting. Before I come to you, in Bhutan, which credential format are you using?
We are using the W3C standard
VCs.
JSON-LD.
Yes.
So
And
I think, like you said, we have tried to implement the ZKP, zero knowledge proof also. I think we might have good news very soon.
so, you know, you also heard one of the things that is still a little bit challenging. There is not one VC standard. There are actually quite a few VC standards. You know, in Europe, for instance, it's two. It's the SDJOTs and MDLs. So one important question is, how can you be sure that your solution actually works? And I think if I would tell my older daughter about a plug fest, she would think that this is a very loud party where you need earplugs, but actually plug fests are something else. And maybe you can tell us what it is and why are these plug fests useful, and why would you want to have an open sandbox?
Yeah, so I represent the FIDES community, which is actually a community started in the Netherlands, but actually now focusing on, yeah, I would say, a global reach, in a way that we just realize exactly what we're talking about here, that there is still no single standard. And for instance, the solution from Bhutan is going to be so much more valuable if it could also be used in the Netherlands, right? If Anand comes to Holland and he wants to prove who he is, or prove his driver license, or any kind of other things, maybe a university degree, then that should be possible. But we know that at the moment there are still differences. So, and we know we don't, it's not magically changing in over a couple of days or weeks. So what we did with the FIDES community is actually we have it's a combination of, on the one hand, wallet providers that work on this technology, sometimes also with different features and standards, together with some public stakeholders like tax offices, chambers of commerce and banks, and also some of the smaller companies, to actually work on concrete examples and show interoperability, show that different wallet providers work in the same use case. So you can choose between the NG wallet and maybe a European wallet from the Netherlands, or maybe from Switzerland. So what we did with Plugfest is actually specify 3 very concrete use cases. For instance, in the first Plugfest we talked about a web shops, e-commerce, and credentials for academics as well as trade. And specify particular specifications and invite any wallet provider to participate. And just show how it works. And of course, we run into all kinds of challenges, right? We knew that. But by doing it, actually, we actually fixed quite a lot altogether. And it wasn't me fixing it, but it was actually all those wallet providers that worked together. And this is also something we already kind of informally also started already, for instance, now with some people in the MOSIP team. But yeah, so that's just a Plugfest is really like a nice milestone to work towards. But at the same time, we don't want to stop at the end of such a Plugfest. So that's why we came up with the idea of what we call an open sandbox, which means that those use cases stay alive. So the issuers, the credentials that are being issued for those use cases can still be issued and received after the Plugfest point. So they just stay there. You can go there, you can just see the login to kind of request credentials. And it also explains clearly which wallets are interoperable with the links to the App Store or the Google Play Store where you can download it. And also just the links to the relying party websites. So for example, we had a clone of the Decathlon web shop, which looks exactly like the normal Decathlon web shop, but we showed how it interacted with mobile wallets and credentials. And maybe one other thing to add is that we also emphasize quite a bit on not just credentials for natural persons, but also for organizations. We think that's also really going to be very more and more important. So for instance, an organization from Asia or from anywhere in the world, being able to prove that they have a particular ISO certificate or maybe a sustainability certificate, things like that, and that can also really fit nicely in a credential.
So I live in a small country in Switzerland, and even though it's really small, we have two different gauges for train tracks, the width of train tracks. And when I think about credential formats and wallets, I always think about one of the train lines in Switzerland, which starts in Geneva and ends in the mountains. And for over 100 years, people would start their journey, and then mid-journey they get off a train, get on another train, and then finish their journey. Because the gauge changes, because the rails are different. And the reality is that the identity rails, just like the payment rails, will be different in the world. In an ideal world, you would probably hope for all the rails in the world to be the same, both physically and metaphorically, but they're not, and they will likely not be for many years. But a couple of years ago, the trains changed. And now there is a train that can actually go all the way from Geneva to the top of the mountain, not because they changed the rails, but because the train, as it goes up, adapts to the different rails. And that's the kind of wallets that I'm hoping for, that we actually have wallets that, like these trains or like a web browser that renders a JPEG image just like it renders a PNG image, and as a user you don't care what the format is, that eventually you may not need to care whether it's an SDJOT or a W3C VC or ISO MDL. Now, in order to get closer to that, we understand there are different standards. Joseph, can I ask you, how do you make sure that a solution conforms to one of these standards? You know more about that than anyone else I know, so maybe you can tell the audience a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I think I'll first say if the actual end user actually gets to the point where they know they've got an SDJOT or an MDoc or a W3VC, we've already done something very, very wrong.
Yes, amen.
So yes, conformance testing. So one of the kind of general policies that the OpenlD Foundation has is that when we develop a specification, before we actually say that's a final version of the specification that's stable and that people should implement, we do a number of things. One is doing interop testing, like Harmen described, and making sure that the protocol actually works, and if two people implement it, then they actually understood the same thing in the spec. Another thing we do is put them through a formal analysis, which is we define an attacker model for the specification, that is the attacks that we want the specification to prevent happening, and you know, that the user's data shouldn't be leaked unintentionally, etc., etc. And then there's a university that we work with that actually does a mathematical analysis. If they produce a mathematical model of the specification and prove that the specification actually prevents the attacks defined in the mathematical model of the attacker model. So that's very good, and it actually always reveals something, usually nothing major, but something that we always kind of tweak a little bit in the spec just to make sure it is fully robust before it becomes that final version of the spec. And then the final big thing we do is we develop conformance tests for the specification. So these are very much focused on making sure that people implement the specification correctly and that they're interoperable, and that they implement the security properties correctly. So this is something that's relatively new in the verifiable credentials space. So, but we've already done a lot of testing with the conformance tests for verifiable presentations. They currently support both SDJOTs and MDocs. We did a set of interop testing with ISO just a week ago, actually, and we've done other test events to show that those tests do actually represent the specification, and then as we do the tests, we actually give a lot of feedback to the spec authors as well about things that we think we're missing or ambiguous or could be made clearer. And the end goal, of course, is that when you actually start plugging together wallets and verifiers and issuers in the real world, that they do actually work together and actually interoperate, and you don't have the situation where you have 10 verifiers and 10 wallets, and each verifier has to test individually with each of the 10 wallets, which is then 100 different sets of testing that's happening worldwide. And obviously these numbers are not 10 in the real world. I've lost count of how many wallets there are in the real world at the moment, but the numbers get scary if you need to test with everyone, even as an individual verifier. So the idea with the conformance test is very much that everybody runs them. It tests both the wallet side and the verifier side. If we have some assurances that both parties are actually conforming to the specification, then hopefully they do actually just interoperate, or if there are any problems, that they're very minor.
You mentioned that in Bhutan, about 40% of the population, really in record time, started to adopt a wallet. That's about 40% more than the average country in Europe, so congratulations again. I'm sure you are happy with the fact that it's 40%. How do the people carrying the wallets and using those credentials feel? Are there any use cases that are already proven to be useful?
Yeah, so 40% of the population, like I said, so so it was a tedious journey, because earlier when we started, we actually started with a platform called Verity, which and then the blockchain we used were Indicio. So what happened was that we had almost 80,000 users onboarded at that time, immediately after when we launched. But somewhere in the middle, suddenly Verity was acquired by some other corporation, and they said that they no longer want to maintain that platform. So we had to again change our platform and blockchain also. So we changed to something called Credible, which is a version of Credo. I think this from Harmen's nation. I think Animo had created that original code. So
and hosted at the Open Wallet Foundation, if I can shamelessly plug that.
I was about to plug. So yeah, so that was one of the reasons why we picked that up, because it was part of the Open Wallet Foundation, and it complies with the European standards. So based on that, then again the pain was that we had to re-onboard all those 80,000 users again, because why we realized that users just migrating from a database and migrating from a blockchain, although we don't put any data in the blockchain, we have a metadata which they have their own private key and public key combination that we put. So that was quite painful, but overall, so I think we can take an example of Philippines also, where we went door to door under certain areas of the country and just helped them on board. That did drive our onboarding, but more than just having a foundation ID was not good enough. I think most of the users were complaining that what do I do with this foundation ID? So we took a step back and we really planned the user journey. So well, like I mentioned, so the main user journey was that we have an app called MBOB, which is a mobile Bank of Bhutan, which is one of the most popular app. So we collaborated with them and we made a use case where we can share the eKYC. So eKYC here is that it comes from our foundation IDs. So I think someone just asked why it's top-down approach. So the foundation ID was the information that is required to open a bank account. So our foundation ID consists of our CID information and then permanent address, which is enough to open a bank account. So once that happened, then we linked the login to that app through NDI, and we kind of made it easier for users to just log in or open bank account. That's when I remember the day when we launched with that bank, the user just shot up. So I think that's one, like people who used in Bhutan, they really see the uses of verifiable credentials because everything gets seamless. And like right now, I don't carry my driving license. I just have it in my wallet and I can show it around to the police there. So actually, the one more thing that helped the adoption was that we have a Bhutan NDI Act, which actually mandates that anything shared through Bhutan NDI's wallet is legal, and people cannot deny service based on that. So anything shared through a wallet is actually legal, and the organizations, once integrated, has to cater to the service. So that, so there was combined effort from our stakeholder, the lawmakers, and us as a project also.
Let me use this opportunity to thank you and Bhutan publicly, because the Open Wallet Foundation has a forum for governments, and we now have about 40, but the very first government that joined was the Kingdom of Bhutan. And when we moved that forum from the Linux Foundation to the United Nations and countries had to reapply, the first country that reapplied was the Kingdom of Bhutan. I think it helps that it's a small country and Jacques knows the king and you get permission very quickly. But thank you so much. It's really a privilege to have you on our Governmental Consultative Committee, and I'm really happy that you are showing that this can be done, but also showing that this is something that a small country can do, and you don't need to be a country with 100 million people, and you don't need to work with trillion-dollar companies, and you can still do that. So really kudos to Bhutan.
Thank you, Daniel. So I think it also helps that there's a intentional digital transformation going on in Bhutan, where we have six very huge projects, and Bhutan NDI especially people give more importance because it's called a flagship project. So that's like the flagship of the ship where rest of the other projects has to follow, and the platform that we built, everything else has to be built on the Bhutan NDI.
Yeah. So I will open the floor after my next question to you, Harmen. So please start thinking about questions to our panelists. You're also living in a kingdom, slightly larger kingdom. How are wallets going in your part of the world?
Yeah, so we're part of the European Union, so yeah, just like Joseph is heavily working on that. But so Holland has started working on its own wallet. So every country in Europe could choose what they would do. They could choose for a model that they would build, that the government would build a wallet, or they could have a model where they would leave it up to the market to build wallets, but then they had to certify to particular specifications, or it could be a combination. And in Holland, actually, they started with the first model, so they started with what they call the NL wallet, but I don't think it's 100% formal yet, but now it seems to change, that actually they're opening it up for the market. And I personally think it's a good idea. And it still allows to have a wallet from the government, if some people want to do that. So I think that's a really important decision, and I think similar like in Germany. So it will be really interesting to see how that goes, but at the same time that is a real challenge also from an interoperability perspective, because how many wallets will we end up with in Europe, right? So maybe one country will have, I don't know, 10 or 15 private wallets that fit according to that law. And then in another country, there's maybe just one European wallet, but each of them have to be interoperable. So it's quite a challenge. But yeah, I think it's a good step forward.
Thank you. This is not supposed to be a YouTube video, but really interactive. Do you have any questions about verifiable credentials, wallets, pixie dust? Do we have a microphone? There is a question over here. I think this was the first question.
Hi, I'm Sudarshan Sen. Bhutan, of course, is uniquely positioned in many ways. But looking to countries where a large segment of the population is not digitally enabled or connected, can a hybrid system work of both centralized credentials as well as decentralized verifiable credentials? Would that work in practice?
I think Bhutan also has a section of, I think, very less digital literacy, and also because similar to Philippines, not island, we have mountains where it's inaccessible. So basically, I think I didn't mention it in my first talk, but verifiable credentials, we are advertising it or really ramping up that, because we don't want people traveling distance just to come and, you know, submit a piece of paper as a form. So that was also one of our motivation. And like I said, people can open their bank accounts just staying at the home at this point in time. But the Edge wallet is it has limitation in the sense that the digital literacy or the lack, because internet penetration is quite high in Bhutan, but it's just the digital literacy is a bit lagging. So we have designed something called a web wallet for people who who don't have a device or are not able to themselves create credentials. So in each of the administrative zone, we have something called a community center, which has a fiber network and all the internet connectivity ready for them. So basically, through this web wallet, what we do is, it's of course the access is through biometric, and you get your foundation ID also through biometric. We have already developed it. So people who don't have a device or not able to themselves do anything, so they can go there, open their wallet, and then also do the transaction through that web wallet. So there is, in the community center, there actually is one IT person who stays there, not for NDI, but it's a general purpose IT for that community sector. So they help them onboard and whatever transaction they would need to do.
I think this is a really brilliant question, because when you ask a room, raise your hands if you want the safest credential solution possible. Almost every hand will go up, right? Who wants an unsafe credential solution? If you ask people, do you want an inclusive credential solution? Every hand will go up again. But the problem is, the safest and the most inclusive are forces pulling in two different directions. And so you have that problem within one country sometimes, both in terms of people who have access to the latest and greatest technology and those people who don't. But you also have it sometimes in terms of age, right? That some people might just not be, even if they have access to a computer or to a phone, might not be as comfortable. So I think we have to be aware that verifiable credentials hold this amazing promise, but we need to make sure that we design a system in a way that balances our desire for the best possible security, which is probably a $1,200 smartphone with the latest in terms of biometrics and secure key storage, with the most inclusive solution, which in terms of credentials is a QR code on a piece of paper, but obviously not as safe. I think there was a question over here.
So, for enabling DC-based digitalized authentications, do you think any immutable ledger or kind of blockchain is mandatory? Or without that also we can do DC-based authentication, point number one. And point number two, so whenever we are going for any kind of DC-based authentications, then key management is, for example, I am asking in the context of cross-border interoperability, ID interoperability, and the PKI infrastructure is having, like, let's say 5 countries come together to establish the cross-border authentication system or cross-border ID authentication. Different countries are having their own protocol for establishing PKI already they do have. Then OpenID Connect, we understand that OpenID Foundation is having a protocol for OpenID Connect. Do OpenID Connect is having their own key management systems, or they are leveraging the existing PKI infrastructure of different countries?
So you absolutely don't need a blockchain to do any of this stuff. Yeah, you can use one if you want, but you don't need a blockchain to do any of this verifiable credential stuff. For the key management piece, I think for the most part, the OpenID specifications are leaving that out of scope. That's possibly not entirely true. One of the options in the OpenID specs is that you can do key management using X509, which is very, very well understood, and people have been using to do this kind of key management for, I don't know, 20, 30 years now, probably. So that's one of the options in the specs. And I mean, yeah, these are already relatively well-solved problems. I mean, all passports these days are digitally signed, and there's a key management process that deals with that. And I never heard a news story of people getting their passports rejected because the key management hasn't worked. So yeah, there are some good solutions to these problems out there already. So we should learn as much as we can from those and reuse them.
Maybe also to add just on that, there's also in our ecosystem there's quite a lot of solutions that use a DID web at the moment. So a DID method without a blockchain, but it has some disadvantages, and now actually some of them, including also the government of Switzerland, they're moving to a new version of that DID web, verifiable history, and that seems quite promising, and also addressing a lot of the topics that you raise.
Hi there, Ed, is that on?
Yeah.
Yes. Ed Duffus here from OpenCRVS. It's relevant to the question. So OpenCRVS is an open source digital public good for civil registration. So obviously an output traditionally of the civil registration process would be a paper-based birth certificate, death certificate, etc. And a number of the countries that we're working with have expressed interest, of course, that in the future that becomes a verifiable credential. So apologies if you mentioned this, and just please refer me back to something you said if that's the case. But obviously, as a digital public good, designed to be used in multiple country contexts, so obviously OpenCRVS already needs to be highly configurable to the civil registration context. Given that there'll be different laws for any one particular country that implements the DPG, plus presumably different set of wallets, and I imagine another requirement would be that it needs to be internationally interoperable. What advice would you give us as a DPG to think about and navigate the various standards which are currently available for PCs?
It's a good one, eh? So I think we use very much the terms interoperability profiles. So it's actually a list of specifications that you kind of choose. So it's not one specification, but it's a list. And for instance, at the moment, one of the profiles that Joseph is highly involved in is called the High Assurance Interop profile. That's something that's actually now very heavily going to be used in Europe. But in a similar way, for instance, we also have a profile initiated which is called the Decentralized Identity Interop profile, and that relies more on the use of decentralized identifiers. So it's quite similar, very similar, also using OpenID for verifiable credentials, but slightly different. So there's actually a range of profiles, but the amount of profiles seems to be becoming less, so that's good news. Yeah, so I think searching for those types of intro profiles, I think is crucial. And then I think it's very much looking, of course, at the regions. Maybe I think there is also something in Africa. I think there's also a collaboration starting there. I don't know if there's maybe also a similar intro profile being realized there.
I heard a really interesting statistic from Google. To the best of their knowledge, there are over 700 standards that factor into a modern web browser. 700. And this is really one of the reasons why, personally, I believe that open source implementations are really important, because if it's just one standard, it's pretty easy. You know, we can all conform to this one standard and we're fine. If you have 700 standards, it is very easy to reintroduce friction in how we are combining those standards, or which profile of that standard we are using. So I would encourage you to look at the implementations that are out there. Don't pick a new one. Go with someone that is out there that you think does a reasonably good job, whether it's the European Union or the Kingdom of Bhutan or the Department of Homeland Security. And I would also encourage you, be part of a conversation to demand something better for the future. There is no French internet. There is no Austrian web browser. You can send an email anywhere in the world, and you don't need to think, oh, this email will go to India or to Manila. I need to use a slightly different standard of the POP3 protocol. So I think all of us, whether we are coming from governments or from IGOs or from standard development organizations, should hope for and work for a future where one day verifiable credentials will be just like email, and you don't need to worry. And for this to happen, the first thing we need to build is trust between people, between government officials, a desire to come together, a desire to do that. And we will try to pursue this together with MOSIP in a conference on July 1st and 2nd, where we are aiming to bring as many folks together as possible to sort of embark on this mission. I think the gentleman right in front of me, you had a question as well.
Yes. Good afternoon. My name is Yankuba from the Gambia. Regarding the issue of wallets, in my country recently there is proliferation. That means many different types of wallets are being developed. And on top of my head, when the guy mentioned about the European Union, I'm like, we are also heading to 10 or 20 different types of wallets. Could there be a way that we could, governments can, administer this issue of wallets to streamline so that you could have a single sign-on? Because in my country, you have a low computer literacy rate, and there is an aggressive marketing that compels everybody to have different type of wallet. So I'm afraid this can be a problem for so many people. So is it possible for governments to administer these issues?
Yeah, I think how Europe is addressing this is that they are kind of going to certify wallets that are allowed to hold government-issued credentials. So that means that if the government, for instance, issues a foundational identity credential, then only those wallets out of the 15, maybe 8, would be certified by the government. So that means that the government kind of sets a number of specifications or rules, and there has to be formal compliance tests, and only those wallets that successfully pass that test could be used. I think makes quite sense, because I think you also want to protect your citizens from malicious software.
Yeah, and I mean, I think this is absolutely a problem we have to try and solve, but essentially if we're all going to come together and have some kind of common system, then everybody has to be willing to compromise. And I mean, unfortunately in the verifiable credentials ecosystem at the moment, there are a lot of players that have some quite strong financial interests, and that means different countries get pulled in different directions by those financial interests to some extent. And at some point we have to recognize that and realize that the outcome of that is that the people actually receiving these credentials in the end, the verifiers or the relying parties, we're making the economics bad by them by not making the compromises at the wallet or the issuer level, and we're ending up with a bad situation for users where a credential from one company from one country doesn't work technically in a different country, and it just gets messy. It gets expensive and complicated for verifiers to actually verify these technologies, and there is a risk there that at some point they say, well, actually this process I have of people taking pictures of their passports and doing selfies actually works better than this kind of mess of verifiable credentials, and we have to keep our eye on that. And I'm not saying it's terrible and we're definitely going to fail, but we have to keep an eye on it and really try and do our best to make sure that the economics for the people actually needing the data at the end work well, and that the systems can be reliable and we can get that kind of cross-border interoperability. And the only way we can get that is if people are willing to come together and compromise and pick a solution that's maybe not the perfect solution for everyone, but is good enough for everyone.
We're here courtesy of MOSIP, and I'm not saying that because MOSIP invited us, but you heard before how Bhutan had to change because a vendor lost interest. And we briefly heard about open source. I think open source can really play an important role, and I think wallets like the Inji wallet are really interesting in that you probably don't want a situation where there is only one wallet by the country. And whenever someone gets a new phone, you sort of force people to download your wallet. You also don't want to be necessarily dependent on a duopoly or oligopoly of a few large players. So I think this is where open source can really help. That even if you have a plurality of wallets, if they're based on 1 or 2 or 3 stacks, it's a lot easier to certify, and it's a lot easier to ensure that they're interoperable. So I think maybe there is a best of both worlds where you can have plurality and still be safe. I hear a message that will take further questions offline, but we also have 3 minutes and 23 seconds to go. Is that says no more question, I assume? Because we do have, okay, I am the moderator. I will now go with the clock and I will go with you. Our last question, please.
Boa tarde. Vou falar em português, como tem sido. Há muitos...
I'm going to translate. We don't have Portuguese simultaneous. Okay. So that's it.
Há muitas realidades e o mundo tem estado a conhecer desenvolvimentos a vários níveis, exatamente ao nível tecnológico.
So we have many different realities out there. Yeah, and depending on where we are, we're seeing different technologies being developed.
Fizeram aqui referência à possibilidade de, por exemplo, eu ao conduzir, exibir através da credencial verificável uma prova da minha idade sem ter que exibir sequer a minha fotografia.
So we had the example before where demonstrating my credential, for instance, of my age without providing any information about anything else about my identity, only the data on my age.
E o desenvolvimento, nós sabemos que vem dos dois sentidos, para o bem e para o mal. Vamos imaginar o caso de terceiro exibir o meu documento, ou seja, certificar que tem aquela idade quando, na verdade, não tem.
So yeah, we heard it before for the good, but there's for the good or there's for the bad. So yeah, what if and sort of in proving our qualifications, let's consider the negative of this.
O que eu gostaria de saber é como funciona exatamente esse sistema de credencial verificável e quais são os riscos associados à falsa identidade, ou seja, à falsa demonstração de algum documento.
Yeah, so if you could discuss a little more about exactly how this works on verifying credentials when it's only specific pieces of data, and what are some of the weaknesses? What are some of the negative connotations of just identifying certain aspects when proving qualifications.
I hate to end with the negatives, but one of you has 30 seconds for the negatives and to close us.
I mean, I'm not... The only real negative, I think, of the selective disclosure mechanism is that it's a bit more technical complexity compared to not having it. In terms of the user's position, there's not really any negatives. I mean, there's possibly some cases where if the wallet's offline for too long, or if you try and do too many transactions where the wallet's offline, that can possibly end up causing problems, because you do have to do particular things that when you're using those selective disclosures, they can be linked to the user if you're not careful about how they use them, and that means you actually end up having underlying in the technology, there's actually multiple copies of the credential. The user's not aware of that, but it is a complexity that's there, and it can potentially surface if you're not careful about how you implement it. But yeah, in general, they're a good thing, and people have figured out how to get around these problems.
Thank you very much. Thank you to my panelists. Thank you very much to the audience for staying here until the very end, and wishing you a very good evening. Thank you.